Welcome to today's webinar, and I am very happy to be doing another one for you all there down under, half a world away from me, and half a year of seasons away too. So tonight we are going to be exploring how to solve defects in soft ripened cheese. I decided to tackle both washed rind cheeses, which there we've got a cracked rind on one on the left-hand side of the screen, and then on the right-hand side, bloomy rind cheese, which is not developing very well in that slide, getting some contamination of some yellow microbe. And so we're going to be exploring both these styles of cheese making, knowing that they are very high in moisture, these cheeses, and very challenging to make. So let's just dive right in, and I'll hopefully run for about 50 minutes, leaving you 10 minutes for questions. So if we want to take a look at the difference between bloomy rind cheese that is made traditionally and washed rind cheese that is made traditionally, it really comes down to different processes of making the cheeses. And in the case of bloomy rind cheese, the tradition was always to make them somewhat lactic in character or highly lactic in character. So the traditional cheese making process delivered cheeses that had higher acidity than most cheeses that you would age. You know, it's kind of like taking, in the case of a lactic style cheese, which is starting at about a pH 4.4 or 4.5, and then ripening that until it changes in flavor and becomes something else. And then from there, we jump into a new style of cheese making in the 20th century to make cheeses with more rennet character. So instead of them being so acidic, the cheesemakers began shortening the process and using less of a lactic type approach to make the curd, setting it overnight, and then doing it all in just one day, getting a cheese made within 24 hours versus say 48 or even longer. And the pH there, the target that we want to end up with is around 4.7 to 4.8. So right there within this great big group of cheeses, and it's very diverse. There's so many cheeses that fit into this category. We have a basic difference between either lactic type cheese making technology or rennet curd type cheese making technology. And I just want to make sure that all of you out there understand that, because we're going to be seeing defects, from both of these big families within the bloomy rind cheese category. And just remember that all of them are very high in moisture, anywhere from over 50%, usually like a camembert or a brie might be 52%, all the way up to 60% for the lactic cheeses. Of course, by the time all these cheeses are ripe, they will lose a certain amount of moisture, but they're still around 50+% moisture content. The key here on this slide is to look at the way they ripen. They're ripened centripetally from the outside in. And this has to do with the action of enzymes from the rind microbes, the yeast and molds that are on the rind. And those are going to be breaking down the acidity, which is calcium bonded with lactic acid called calcium lactate. That will start to raise the pH and activate these reactions that cause the paste to soften, the protein bonds to loosen up. And then, eventually when the cheese is perfectly ripe, there'll be no acid type core left at all. But, many people enjoy the lactic style cheeses, especially, traditionally being made from goat's milk. They, like your aged chevs, they're going to have a two paste character, both with a ripe paste from the rind in about halfway, and then still retaining somewhat of lactic character type core. So really interesting group of cheese right here to explore. The next would be the washed rind cheeses. And these, there are some exceptions with your washed rind cheeses to this rule of having the higher pH. And we still have the centripetal ripening, but we, we also have more activity from rennet in these cheeses because of the pH being somewhat higher. The rennet is a bit more active. And we also have some exceptions to this rule, as in the case of Epoisse. If you're all familiar with that cheese, it has to be sold, distributed and sold in a wooden box because it's so soft. But that is made from lactic type curd to start out. So there are some exceptions, but in general, we're trying to make these soft ripened washed rind cheeses with higher pH values so they have a more supple paste, even as a young cheese. But there again, we're focusing this lecture on very high moisture cheeses. So we're not talking about monastery type cheeses that are semi-hard and would have like 40 to 45% moisture. We're talking about these very high moisture, soft ripened washed rind cheeses. They are more stable than the bloomy rind cheeses in that they have a longer shelf life. So rather than expiring by the time they reach 60 days, they are just maybe getting interesting at 60 days, getting very strong, but they're still got a month or more to go before they would be expiring. And interestingly enough, the technology that's used to make these cheeses with more thermophilic cultures is what is used to make what's called stabilized paste bloomy rind cheese. So that's your more industrial type bloomy rind cheese that is very stable during distribution and storage, has a very long shelf life, but a very mild flavor. So we're going to have to differentiate there so that we have a good understanding about the difference between a bloomy rind cheese that's rather quite mild and very stable on the shelf versus the previous slide where I was mentioning how the traditional cheeses are much more dynamic in the way they ripen, and they are going to have stronger flavors. So let's jump into the washed rind cheeses first, and I have a few examples up here that I'm pulling from France. Really, there's Taleggio is an Italian cheese, and the Vacherin Mont d'Or is made both in Switzerland and in France. So I'm sure you all out there in the audience, some of you are making cheeses like this, and you have your own names, and I've done that in my career, and we have some in Vermont and all that. So it's a style that's made all around the world, and people really like these cheeses because they're a little bit funky, like they have a stronger flavor, and definitely a more powerful aroma than other cheese categories. But because they're so challenging to make, we end up with mishaps and get defects from either the cheese making process or the aging process. And so it can be a bit nerve-wracking at times to be making these. But I think what's important to recognize is that if you do a good job as a cheese maker and in the make room, getting the cheese chemistry right, by the time the cheese is ready to go into the drying room, then you're already on your way, to get good microbial growth, the proper kind of microbes growing in at the right time. And then this of secondary importance are the conditions in the cave. So we're going to take a look on this next slide to show the successive growth of the rind microbes. We have three distinct stages, and we can add in a fourth if we want to talk about making a washed rind cheese that has a a bit of mold on the surface. At the end, the whitish Geotricum candidum type mold is desired by some affineurs and encouraged to take a little bit of space on the rind by stopping to wash the rind. Once you've got a happy washed rind cheese going and it looks great, it's orangey, tannish, reddish, whatever color you're going for, and you're happy with that, many affineurs will choose to stop washing with water in your solution and let the mold settle in. And that's a cheese like Pont l'Evêque would be an example of that in France. And we call that kind of a mixed rind cheese or washed rind cheese. So the first stage is very evident from the aroma wafting off the cheese. That's the yeast stage. The second stage is when the rind starts to get a bit tacky, and that's when the micrococci are growing in. These first two microbes are setting the table for the coroniforms, which we all tend to finally refer to as the brevibacterium. But there are also a couple of others that are in raw milk that have been harvested out and are available as cultures, and those are the Corynebacterium and Arthrobacter. So, whether you make raw milk cheese or pasteurized milk cheese, you can still have all three of these species growing on your or on your cheese rind, and they produce different color tones. And so here we're looking at more like a 4-week period where they're growing in, and then finally, like I said, up to the affineur whether they're going to let the geotricum settle in or not. Some affineurs will choose to spray that on after they stop washing. Others already have it in their caves, so it'll just happen. That's in my case. That's what happens. So that's really good. If we've done that and we have a good smear, it's really hard for contaminants to get a foothold. And so we have to be very aware of these stages, have expectations, be looking for and both the appearance and the aroma that comes along with their growth. The poor smear development is really the root of most of the defects in washed rind cheese on the rind, because without a good smear, we can get contaminants growing. However, if the smear can be both insufficient, which would make the cheese very mild, and unhappy consumers that used to love our very strong washed rind cheese may not be so happy, or if it gets really out of control, then we can get some problems that run right into creating other defects such as flavor defects, and people can be quite turned off by cheeses that are going this direction. So let's jump in first and look at the rind issues. But before that, we're going to take one last look at the important things about making these cheeses well. So we need to know how to do that before we can find the root causes of defects. We need to understand what it takes to make the cheese turn out well. First of all, it's the chemistry, and I've already touched on the pH needing to be in this good zone of 5.2 to 5.4, and that's after brining or salting. And then we typically use a wash solution made with just water and salt, and then the ripening rind type cultures added into that if we want to. And like myself, that make it from raw milk, all the stuff is already in there, and I've had cheese in my cellar now for over 10 years, so I really don't need to do anything but use the salt water. And we would not want to use brine. That's too strong in salt, and also the pH is too low really to be effective in raising the pH on the rind, so that the acid sensitive bacteria, those coroniforms, are going to be happy. And then again, we get to the geotricum, whether we want that to grow or not. That's the affineur's choice. Then let's go take a look at the environment, temperature, humidity, and ventilation. These are the things that must be controlled. And I've got some values there for the ideal parameters. You're getting a PDF of this, so I don't really need to read this, but just remember that for soft ripened washed rind cheeses, we get quite a bit of, uh, um, of oxygen being used, and as these microbes grow. And so they also produce ammonia more strongly than any other type of cheese aging process. So that that last bullet point about exchanging the air is really important. Not overloading the cell or the cave, first of all, and then secondly, right along with that, in tandem, making sure we have an air exchange system. To We may not need it in the beginning when there's a little bit of cheese in there, but as we begin to put more and more cheese in, we're going to definitely need it. And it has to be a variable so that we can, accommodate lower volumes, higher volumes. Now we're going to jump in to the actual defects. And so the way I thought I'd do it, um, today is I would focus on the rind first, and we'll do washed rind defects first, and then we'll go do bloomy rind defects because they are very different. We're talking about with washed rind cheese, we don't want mold on the rind until it's done. Like here on this defective cracked cheese, we actually have a pretty nice surface here that I like to see on my washed rind cheeses. And I'm not embarrassed to say this is something I made because this cheese got gassy, it started to split, and that's how it goes sometimes. But at any rate, this is kind of like what I like for my look on my washed rind cheeses. And you see the scattering of the indigenous white mold. This cheese was actually washed with a strong Belgian style sour ale of about 12% alcohol. Uh, one full 12-ounce bottle per wheel, wiped on that cheese over 3 months. And and that's what we're talking about with a washed rind cheese. Some sort of solution wiping periodically on it to prevent mold from growing, versus the bloomy rind cheese where we want the mold to grow. We want to have a great growth of yeast or mold or both. So let's take a look at the soft rind cheeses uh, first of the for rind defects, and then when I go into the texture and paste, the same thing. I use them as synonyms. Um, and rind and appearance, those are taken together. How the cheese looks, what's growing on the rind, the color of the rind, the texture of the rind, the quality of the rind. Then we have texture paste defects and the flavor defects, and those I'll take together for both washed rind and bloomy rind because a lot of them have similar roots. So here we go. Let's take a look at washed rind defects. And the first one that's really common, and I've struggled with this to learn how to do good washed rind affinage, um, and finally have a handle on it after all these years. I think I can do a reasonably good job making washed rind cheese. And so these are some of the things that would be causing a thick, sticky rind that could actually begin to get so bad from being this really thick smear to where you're trying to maybe wipe this stuff off and you realize that, my gosh, there's no rind left where that stuff is because there's so much proteolysis that it's eaten away the cheese rind. So some of the causes: high pH cheese. When your cheese pH is above 5.4 and you put it into um, the the drying room and then the ripening room, it goes right to growing stuff on it. The acid sensitive bacteria growing much quicker, the yeast and the micrococci growing quicker. Everything is accelerated, and if if you make the mistake of washing with solutions like you normally would when your pH is in the better zone, you're going to develop this very thick, sticky rind pretty quickly. So the other thing that can happen is if you're using a new brine or your brine has gotten really low in calcium, which, I mean, the only way a brine can be low in calcium is when you make it up new, because uh, when you're making a brine for the first time, you should be putting in some calcium chloride to balance it with the calcium content of the cheese. Otherwise, the calcium leaves the cheese, giving you a very soft, sticky rind. And that's even without any growth on it. So remember that we've got we've got that as a factor, as a cause too. But really, if we've got that under control, which I'm sure most of you do, it's really a matter of um, of how these early growing microbes get get growing so fast and so hard to control. So the humidity could be too high in the ripening room, and so therefore the moisture can't evaporate off the surface of the cheese in the time frame it should, and you're just getting more and more growth. It leads to putrefaction even, where you can just start to smell the cheese doesn't smell very good. And it's like, wow, what do I do? Uh, I may have poor ventilation. I may be overpacking the aging room. This is a super important bullet point right here. Um, and so you go in and figure out the capacity for your aging room. And yeah, so you're used to this certain amount you can put in there. And now I'm going to start to do soft ripened, high moisture wash rind cheese. And you're like, oh, well, I'll just, I can put in that much cheese. Well, you really can only put in 60% as much. There just isn't going to be enough oxygen and space between the cheese. So we need to keep a good amount of air above the cheese and then a foot below. And so don't overpack that room and things will work out much better for you. So here are the causes, but let's take a look at the remedies. One other thing I forgot to mention is if you're using wooden boards to age the cheese on, one of the ways you can get a rind that's becoming too thick and sticky is if the boards were put in there before they were actually dry. And we're looking for about a 35 to 40% moisture content in a cheese aging board. So we like to put the boards in a day before we're going to put cheese on them so they acclimate to the room. But if if you've washed a bunch of boards and they aren't really dried out and you go put them in there, then the board isn't going to be taking moisture from the cheese effectively and storing it, and allowing that rind to develop properly. It'll not be drying out slowly between the washings, which is what you want, and then eventually becoming nice and stable and tight. It's going to stay moist and sticky. So don't worry, don't forget about the boards either. But really, the thing I found is when you see this defect starting, don't use your solution anymore. Um, get control over the environment if you have to. The environment may be fine. And if the environment's fine, then it's really critical to stop washing the cheeses. Just turn them and rub it. Rub that sticky stuff around, and that may take care of it. Within a week or two, it may be perfectly fine. It may be just that little bit of extra growth. But if it persists, then you've got to go um, to more serious interventions, such as trying to use an acidified wash solution to prevent the yeast and then especially the acid sensitive bacteria from growing out of control. And then another thing, interestingly, that I've done in my career that works quite well is when you just use this Debromyces hansi yeast culture on its own. That actually has a rind drying function in the way those yeast seem to are able to absorb water vapor, and so it is very effective, but it leaves kind of a crystalline look to the rind. That's the only thing there. So that's something as well. And then don't be surprised if once you begin to get control over this, that the rinds begin to crack in spots like that very first opening slide for the presentation. You can get cracking, and in some cases it almost looks like a mud flat, like drying out in the sun, when it just starts to crack in this pattern, these platelets. And I've seen that happen on cheeses like the one back up there here, that it's got so thick of a smear. Now when that, we that begins to dry out, it's just going to be cracking in different places. So this is really beyond repair, almost, pretty sure. And that's what happens when you begin to try to gently scrape the stuff off. There may be no rind left. So what's your option? Well, I'll just move it to a drier place that's better ventilated, and I'll let it dry out. Well, that's when you get the cracks. So now we have some mold issues to talk about for defects. And yes, even on washed rind cheese, we can have mucor growing in, and it can be a real pain to deal with. So here are the causes of the mucor mold. And this is classic. This happens in bloomy rind cheese as well. I've dealt with it a lot in my career, and definitely cheeses that are more acidic and have higher moisture than you would want are going to be good candidates for mucor growth. Mucor also doesn't like above 1% salt, so it can grow in on cheese before salting. In this case, it did that, and it just never, we could never get rid of it. We actually had to, this was just one batch. And what happened was the cheese make room got a little cool overnight. It was in the fall in Vermont, and we didn't think it was going to be that cold that night. And we didn't turn the heater on. And so we thought it would be warm enough overnight. It was just that much colder that night that the cheeses didn't drain all the way. And so because they were made from raw milk, you have your mesophilic, or if it was pasteurized milk with mesophilic type cultures in there, then you're going to get an over acidification happening. So the pH was a little bit lower than we like 4.9 or something, and they weren't drained as well, and they just grew mucor very, very well. So those are some of the causes. And then when we move on to the drying room to talk about, the first stage of aging the cheese, if we don't leave it in there long enough, where it's like 85% relative humidity with good ventilation, and turn it frequently for a day or two, 2, 3, 4 times during that period, then we may get some mucor. And then the other thing to look at is just, do I have good ventilation in my facility, in my creamery? Because wherever we have damp, cold areas, we're going to get spores of mucor hanging around. So of course, the remedies here are to create conditions that are favoring the growth of yeast and not mold. And so, a lot more air moving around. We want to make sure we don't get the cheese in the drying room with too much humidity. We want to make sure that moisture is being evaporated off the surface rather than staying on there. And then we can begin to think about increasing the temperature a bit, because mucor doesn't do as well as the temperature goes up a couple degrees. And finally, just creating more space and more oxygen and air in the room where the cheese is. Then we have moldy rinds from just cross-contamination type situation. And these are some cheeses that I made years ago. And this was a cross-contamination from the tome, a goat milk tome, semi-hard cheese, that this got contaminated for the very first time after I'd been making this style of cheese for like 5 years. We were short on cheese aging boards, and we got some through our maintenance man. He had some good boards in his garage, and so we got them, we washed them, pressure washed them down, and we dried them, and we cut them to length, and yet they still had spores in them. Pretty hard to get stuff like that out of wood completely. We didn't heat treat them, so that could have done it. But anyways, we got this going on the tome, and we're like, wow, this is crazy. And eventually through just good management and keeping the contaminated cheese isolated, we got rid of it. But one thing that did happen was that through the brushes, we weren't being careful about keeping the brushes segregated. We spread it onto this mold ripened cheese that we were making. And so just be aware about that. One thing that you'll learn for sure when you're making wash drying and mold ripened cheeses is that the molds do better at a bit lower relative humidity, and the acid sensitive bacteria and yeast do a bit better at the higher levels of relative humidity. And you saw that in the first slides where I put in the ideal parameters for the relative humidity there. And so we're going to see later on a blue mold on a bloomy rind cheese, which is very common, especially on the lactic style ones, the croton, like the goat cheeses. And of course, they're ideal candidates for blue mold to grow because they have these low pHs like 4.5. Whereas here, we could be struggling with it on a wash rind cheese if we just got down below 5.1. You're going to see blue mold attracted to that cheese. It's pH 5.0. It really likes 5.0. And so if you also have, similar to mucor, a lack of ventilation and air exchange, you're going to see blue mold. It's a microaerophile, meaning that it does much better in conditions where there's limited amounts of oxygen versus the bloomy type rind microbes like your penicillin candidum. So on a wash rind cheese, you got to have that good ventilation and air exchange. And so one way to defeat the other molds is to just keep the humidity up and have good ventilation and air exchange. So increase the humidity during ripening, segregate the brushes. Also think about doing this. Wash the young cheeses first with the solution, only using enough solution for each day's work, and move to the older cheeses. That way you're not spreading contaminants back to the young ones. And finally, we have some other rind defects, 4 of them I picked out here. So a dry surface with a lack of growth, like on this cheese, it's kind of, it's got some patches where there's not much happening here. And it's got this crack out at the corner, and probably got too salty here. Maybe it was over brined, something like that, to cause moisture to be drawn out here to then create a thicker kind of rind, as it dried and then cracked. So watch out for that. Then we have sandy gritty. So this is an indication of excessive proteolysis, the breakdown of protein on the rind. And this could be coming from too much humidity in the ripening room. And then also these high temperatures could cause the proteolysis to be accelerated. And that just means you're breaking down the caseins more rapidly, so you're liberating minerals and shorter strands of protein, and some of them crystallize. Some of the actual amino acids that are building blocks of protein crystallize. So when you get this crystallization, it causes that sandy or gritty quality. A little bit of it is acceptable, but it can be really over the top. And the cheese just isn't, you really have to cut the rind off if you want to enjoy the cheese. And it could be because you wrapped the cheeses when the rinds were quite moist, and then that could accelerate that proteolysis. If it's slight, again, like I just said, it's the sign of a nicely ripened cheese. It's really, I think some people actually kind of like a little bit of that. So as we know, cheese eating is very subjective, and so what one person calls a slight defect may not be a defect at all to others. But however, this is about just trying to shoot for perfection. And if you have that already going on for you, that there's a little grittiness there, but you're selling the cheese well, and it's kind of known for that, then hey, leave it alone. But you don't want it to be an overpoweringly enough to be thought of as a defect. Then we can see this. If you have yellow spots on your cheese, and then you put the cheese under a black light and it fluoresces, that we know is Pseudomonas fluorescens. And it's actually more prevalent on washed drying cheeses than most any other family of cheese. It likes a bit higher pH. It shows up pretty quickly. It's in water, so that's some people I know that have had it have had their water tested to make, and found it in there. Um, on the other hand, it could be just a stage the cheese is going through where then it dissipates. So as the cheese ages out, it goes away. So it could just be a temporary type situation. Uneven. So right here, really interesting what happened to this rack of cheeses here. These above and below are nice washed rind cheeses. Dandelion wine that I make here in Vermont. I washed a cheese with that. It was lovely. This is a more of a mixed rind cheese with a good appearance, but this is really strange looking. You got more like a dry area on one side and a more grown in area on the other. And that is generally, as far as I can tell, that's from not turning the cheese enough and getting it equally dry before it goes into the ripening room. And maybe it could have sat on one side longer in the cheese room during draining. So not turning the molds over enough during draining can also bring that into play. Because think about it, when these cheeses are getting into the drying room in the early stages of ripening, the water is still moving down from the top to the bottom of the cheese. It's not locked up completely yet. So just remember that turning the cheese at all stages from the make through to when you see good growth coming in, that's very important. So bloomy rind cheeses. And here we have, again, some very good challenges to make these cheeses well. And it has to do again with the chemistry and the conditions in the cave to get the proper sequence of microbial growth. So here we go, just a quick look at the stages for a bloomy rind cheese aging process. And it's very important to get these things to happen at the right time. So these are some cheeses that I made that have completely natural bloomy rind. I didn't use any special cultures. And so I'm waiting in the make room till I see some good yeast growth. And then I'm moving them to the cooler aging room with high humidity to get that natural yeast and Geotrichum candidum to grow in by 8 days. So here are some of the parameters. You can look at those in detail when you get your handout. So I'll just truck along here. And we, again, are going to look at this just like we did with the washed rind cheeses. We have these specific pHs we want to hit. And here we have the lactic type cheeses. And here we have more of a rennet curd type camembert. We want to get the yeast growing in early to deacidify the surface so the penicillin candidum can grow, or not. So here we have just a Geotrichum type rind cheese where we didn't even use penicillin candidum as a culture. And then we have our ideal temperatures and relative humidities. And we have to have good air mixing, especially in the drying and ripening. And finally, we have a packaging stage here where the cheese has gotten to this point or this point, and we want to use the ideal packaging to keep the cheese in good shape as it moves through and develops more flavor and the texture changes. So this is a classic one, toad skin or greasy thick skin cheese. A lot of proteolysis is going on, so we have this breakdown right under the rind. It's actually quite unattractive when you have this, because you cut the cheese open and you don't, I mean, it's really not holding together. So it can be a very serious defect, like in this case, or it can be somewhat minor. But at any rate, we want to get a handle on it. It's wild yeast, and the main one is called Oidium geotricum lactis, and it can come from not salting or like delaying the salting. So then we get just a excessive growth of wild yeast that are hanging around in the make room. And then if our temperatures are too high in the ripening room, we can get it too. So the remedies are to go against that, do the opposite. The this cheese right here also has a strange texture, a kind of a curdy texture. So let's get to that. But next we have yellowing or browning of the rind. This cheese here, that all happened after it was packaged. It was packaged. It was very definitely. It had to do with condensation in the package, and then accelerated development of bacteria rather than the mold. You can see the mold has been dying off in areas as the cheese was in the package. Up here, you can see for sure. And then, so that excessive proteolysis just made this cheese break down in extreme fashion, leaving just this hunk of unripe curd there and all this runny stuff. So really important to do good drying. You know, cheese goes through a drying room to start, and then we want to be able to move the cheese into a colder, drier space before we wrap them to help evaporate that surface moisture that was in the ripening room, because it's a very humid in the ripening room. Do not stack the cheeses one on top of the other after you wrap them. Make sure they stay apart, either in breathable boxes or on racks. And then packaging is super important. Once the cheese is out of your hands, you've got to have the right packaging to keep it in good condition as it ripens, because it's going to go through the whole chain of distribution, storage, you know, moving along. And the packaging is intended to keep that cheese in good shape. You've got to get the right stuff. Dried and cracked rinds, that is just comes down to the environment being too dry, or the rind just, you know, accelerated growth of penicillin mold, and you can prevent that by rubbing it down, by sort of like patting it down or rubbing it into the cheese, and then getting control over the environment so that it doesn't get too thick. And then we have a lack of mold growth, just it never gets going, and that can have to do with some medications. But it could also have to do with the culture you've added to the milk. It may not be effective anymore. And here we see again mucor coming back. This time it's on a bloomy rind cheese. We see Pseudomonas coming back. This time it's on a bloomy rind cheese. Bloomy rind cheese. Sorry, this looks like spots of water maybe got, you know, sprayed on it somehow. And so we're just going to go back to the same causes here that we talked about with the washed rind cheeses. And then finally, for old, you know, very ripe camembert and other kind of bloomy rind cheeses, we begin to see reddish brown coloring, and that's just a sign of an older cheese. It can also happen if the cheese was, you know, was packaged and kept in a very humid environment. That could accelerate the development of these microbes that have those pigments versus the mold. Oops. And this is a big one, especially on your croton, your lactic type cheese, that people struggle with mightily at times. Blue mold is very tenacious, and it likes this low pH that these cheeses have, you know, 4.5, 4.4. If the cheeses didn't drain all the way, and they're high in moisture, so they still have a lot of lactose, you know, they're going to feed the growth of the penicillin because it likes that low pH. If we salt, one way we can remedy this is to delay the salting, to let the yeast grow in first, smell them, see them, then we can salt the croton. People have had a lot of good luck with that as a remedy. Um, Take a look at also getting more air exchange and keep the cheeses spread out more. That will help the good stuff grow in versus the blue mold, which likes low oxygen and low ventilation and acid. So just try to combat these things that are growing on your run that you don't want by taking the stance of, well, I'm not going to give them what they want. I'm going to give the good guys what they want, and that way I won't see them anymore, hopefully. So flavor defects, the major ones here, we'll go through these one at a time. And acid, sour taste, post-acidification. These cheeses all can have this because of their high moisture content. And so we can have acid still being made during the later stages of draining, drying, and ripening. And so that can end up causing that cheese to just have a sustained acidity that won't go away. So be careful in your make process to keep, in your wash drying cheese, to keep your pH above 5. Use less starter, whatever you have to do. In wash drying cheeses, curd washing is actually quite common, and that's a good way to keep the pH from dropping. The other way to do it is by using thermophilic cultures as starters. And then in your lactic cheese making, we can use those yeast cultures, and those help deacidify the paste and prevent this post-acidification that leads to the acid. Bitterness is generally it's proteolysis. So we're looking at milk that's been stored for quite a while, and that means we have higher loads of proteases in the milk. But also, again, we can get post-acidification leading to bitterness. And then cheeses with low salt, high moisture, that they're prone to bitterness. And then packaging materials. That can cause bitterness to develop very quickly, especially in a bloomy rind. If that vapor can't leave the cheese, it's going to drive proteolysis and create this bitterness on the rind. So age the cheese at colder temperatures if you can. That'll keep bitterness from developing. And then take a look at the starter cultures, because the mesophilic type starters, you can get some of the specific strain direct vat set starters have higher aminopeptidase activity. They're breaking down the peptides that we perceive as bitter. So then we'll lose the bitterness that way. Flat flavor or lack of flavor, salt is a big deal in terms of flavor development, and also just with the wash drying cheese, we're actually looking at on the other side that we've just used too much salt on the rind, so the microbes never grew in well. So whether it's a bloomy rind cheese where we have lack of salt, just doesn't really add to the flavor, or a wash rind cheese in the paste. But then here it's on the rind of a wash rind cheese, it was too salty. And so we can also discourage the development of the good microbes if we have these conditions. Fruity and fermented and metallic, those are defects that just trying to get caught up here. Those are defects that can occur due to these spore forming bacteria, and some of them or their source might be fermented feeds, for example. It could also just be conditions aren't as sanitary as they should be. Higher pH cheeses are prone to these odd fermentations that deliver us off flavors, and that's really what we're talking about here with these ones. It's just something that isn't quite right, a little bit of an odd fermented flavor. Fruity would indicate yeast growth. Metallic, whey retention. So we can kind of begin to think about, the source there by pinpointing the actual flavor defect. Then we have a few more. Try to wrap this up pretty quick. And we have, alcoholic, it indicates good yeast activity, and it's an early stage kind of thing. So generally speaking, it's just something we notice. It's not really a defect, but if it's persistent, then we can use a colder temperature and exchange the air more to help diminish the growth of the yeast. And some of them are very interesting aromas. There's even one that's a little bit like bananas that you can get going in your aging room if you're not careful with the air exchange. Ammoniated is, of course, the sign of a cheese that's getting over the hill. Yeasty flavor may have to do with sanitation, but here's an interesting thing too, that when you're using whey as a starter, which is very common in France with lactic cheese making, yeast grows really well in whey, so that could be something to look at. And then finally, we have a few other off flavors that can occur. So I've tried to just nail the major ones for you all to think about. And the soapy flavor has to do with breakdown of fat, and that's why we're looking at cheeses that they're made from high fat milk and maybe poorly drained. And this could be a lactation thing where you've got late lactation milk, it's always much higher in fat, and all of a sudden you're like, wow, these cheeses are kind of soapy, they're a little off, and it could just be that. And so you may have to end up making something else, or you can try things like elevating the temperature in the room to get better draining, whatever, but it may just be difficult to make a good aged cheese from late lactation milk, is what you may find out. So texture defects, and here we have some tubes of milk that were lacto fermentation testing, that exhibit some coliform contamination, all these little bubbles. And however, we can also see small gas bubbles from these microbes that come from pasture legumes like clovers and alfalfa. And then we have our coliform group. So that's definitely a coliform contaminated cheese there with all these little fisheye type gas bubbles. So those are definitely going to be from sanitary type considerations as the way we will remedy the coliform problem. Split cheese, that's poor knitting of the curd. So, the curd isn't actually fusing together well, and it's not really there the next day. It's just not holding together, and we start to get these splits. And first we can see them on the surface, and then eventually, the cheese sort of opens up. So that has to do with cheese making technique, and then maybe some gas being formed as well. But that goes back to the cheese room mostly. Mechanical openings are interesting because there are a few of them in here, and that has to do more with how much whey we leave with the curds as we're making the cheese. So then we will take a look at some deformed cheese. So really kind of the antithesis of just a cheese that is not going to really make it into aging because it's already lost its shape. There's just something definitely not right about it. And it could have to do with these things: low acidity, the temperature in the room too low, and then maybe we're working with milk that's really high in fat. So one I worked with a cheesemaker on this, and actually by salting the cheeses, they still had high enough acidity to be ready to salt. So he began salting them in the molds, and then that seemed to work out. The cheeses toughened up that way. The other remedy could be to actually brine salted cheese right out of the mold, and that'll keep it from spreading out as well. Here's that mealy or grainy texture back on that earlier slide with the runny rind I mentioned. And then I'm just gonna let you guys have this to look at because we need to have some time for questions. We've got a classic one for bloomy rind cheese. We have dry chalky paste, and so this is where you have that again problem with too much acidification occurring later, and then we can take a look at at, at remedying that by getting our ladling of the lactic curd just at the right point. That will really help. And then we also want to move the cheese right along so that it begins to develop good microbes on the rind. And finally, don't forget these yeast cultures work really well on that, preventing that hardening of the paste. Gassy texture, we're already looking at that, definitely with the coliform or yeast even. And then it's not very common to see late gas blowing, which is when your cheese begins to get gas after 3 weeks or so. That's not as common to see in these soft ripened cheeses. But we may see it in, say, a washed rind cheese that has the higher pH if we're feeding fermented feed. I've seen it happen. So it's, along with a low salt, it could cause these bacteria to grow fairly well because we're still looking at 2 months or more before a washed rind cheese is ready for sale. And then finally, this is just a very slight runny texture. I mean, actually this cheese, I'm sure people would love to eat that, but this is really, when I make this cheese and I want to get a good stable cheese in the market, I'm looking for more of a texture like that. See how the rind's a bit thinner here? Then this cheese has that more rumply, thicker rind. So a little bit of extra proteolysis going on here. And we can, make this cheese a little bit better so that we can bring it up to that. And we definitely want to avoid that earlier slide image where we had the paste running right out of the rind. So that is what I have for you tonight. I apologize for just going right to the time, but I hope we can do some questions still.
Please open up your chat box. We have got a couple of questions there.
Okay, good.
We do ask if you have other questions, please can you type them in pretty quick so that we can get Peter to answer.
I have to get, where am I?
Now, Peter, I am really impressed that as a cheesemaker, you were happy to show all those pictures, many of which were.
Yeah, go ahead.
That you had issues with. Yeah.
So let's see, regarding ventilation, how do you judge the need to freshen air versus the chance of reducing the microclimate to being not functional for maturation? The way you judge it is by the odor. So it's about ammonia. So when you can detect some ammonia, you need to begin to exchange the air. And as long as you keep it's just a very hint of ammonia is okay, or less, then you're keeping that microclimate that is advantageous to the development of a good cheese rind in both cases. But like I said, the washed rind cheeses are much more demanding for air exchange than the bloomy rinds. The bloomy rinds aren't in the room as long, so you're opening the door a lot more. I mean, not a lot more, but the opening of the door during the several days it's in there generally is enough. Some cheesemakers have air exchange in their bloomy rind ripening rooms and others don't. So then we have Pseudomonas. If there is contamination early in maturation, which clears up, will it still contribute to spoilage? I have not seen that. When you know that Pseudomonas has contributed to a defective cheese, it starts to get like breakdown on the rind, and it also gets kind of a odor that's just not very pleasant. Um, some people akin it to urine actually. And so, yeah, it would be obvious if it's gotten to the point where it's going to impact the cheese quality, I would say. Yeah, it's a thing about persistence, right? If it's still there after 8 days or so, then probably it won't be a very good cheese. All right, I guess that's, anybody else have anything?
No, that seems to be all for now, Peter. So,
All right.
yep. Look, thank you so much. I'm really impressed with you sharing those pictures of all cheeses that you hadn't had such good luck with. I think that.
Could I say one more thing
Yeah,
before
sure.
we go? I would just say that, it's been great to do this, and I probably did take off more than I could chew. But what's really good is that by doing this presentation, I put a lot of stuff up into it that you now have to use as a resource to help you solve defects. So I hope that will be, this will be something like that you can use in your own cheese making practice.
Mm. So, look, we hope to get Peter, we will get him back next semester as well. But if you've got ideas on what you would like to hear from Peter, we're going to do one on defects with harder cheeses, but also Peter and I were chatting about another presentation he's developed. And Peter, can you explain that one?
Yeah, so this is a presentation that causes the cheesemaker to look at your whole business when you're trying to expand production. So what are the factors that I need to consider to successfully expand my cheese production is the idea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'd like you to do other sessions on bloomy cheese. So
Yeah, I mean, I could really just do one, I could do a session on bloomy cheese where I can talk about lactic type 1, rennet curd type 1, and then stabilized paste, and just go through the technology of making the cheeses. That would be a good one for an hour. So you could think about that too.
Okay, so we've got plenty to keep us going. Peter is happy for you to contact him in the coming week. Look, if you email me, I'll pass your questions on to Peter, not a problem. Otherwise, you can look up dairyfoodsconsulting.com, which is there on that slide, and contact Peter that way. So have a great evening, Peter. We'll have a lovely daytime.
All right. Yeah, enjoy your day. I hope it's sunny.